All right, so we're in Luke 29 to 19. Jesus has made his way down to Jerusalem. He sets his face, 10-chapter road trip. And now he just came in. So the context is he's just come into the city for what we know as Palm Sunday, even though in the Gospel of Luke, much like Matthew and Mark, there are no palms mentioned. Only in the Gospel of John are there palms. Anyway, he comes into the city to the cry of, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." So this sounds a little bit like the choir of angels that sings when Jesus is born. But we're not studying Palm Sunday, so we're not going to get into that in great detail, but it's a big deal. Jesus comes into loud cries and praise, and he weeps over Jerusalem because it's going to be destroyed. And this is kind of a sad thing. Maybe we're not expecting this. Although in Luke's gospel, the high become low, the low become high, one of the major themes, it would stand to reason that the high and holy city of Jerusalem would be brought low. Jesus then goes to the temple, drives out all who are selling. Luke leaves out, and he also drives out the ones who are buying, meaning that Luke is a little bit more sympathetic to the pilgrims who are coming to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, and less sympathetic to the people who are making money off of them, even though they're providing a valuable service. Again, this idea of Luke favoring the underdog. And he clears people out of the temple and he begins teaching there. And as he is teaching, he is challenged by the priests, the chief priests, and the scribes. They don't like what he is saying. Okay. Now, so that is the backdrop for all of this. Now, this is important. It says he began to tell the people this parable. We'll come back to that at the end. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant. They also beat and treated him shamefully and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one also they wounded and cast out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Did I leave something out here? Did I leave something out?
I think you just have one sentence missing there.
Yeah. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? Sorry. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Surely not." But he looked directly at them and said, "What then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." The scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he had told this parable against them, but they feared the people. Let me just interject that there because that's important. Sorry about that. All right. So that is so far the parable, right? So let's go back and we're just going to make a few comments about this parable so far. You've heard this parable before. Again, Coop and I disagree in the Matthew version what it's about, but let's not bring that in here. This is the Lucan version. Okay. So we will spend some time, and this is where the fun is going to be, comparing this parable to the parallel in Matthew. That there are significant differences in it, which I think leads to a different, Luke has a different meaning in this parable than Matthew does. I think, which is fine. They're both inspired, inerrant, and infallible, and they can have a different meaning to the parable if they want. The point is, from the beginning, we see that the tenants are wicked. They do not give fruit to any of the servants who are sent. They should have done this. It's not theirs. It belongs to the master. They owe the master whatever the master wants from the vineyard. And here, the master just wants some of the fruit. He's even open to the idea, it would seem, of letting the tenants keep more than is their fair share, right? The master is not greedy in this version at all. The tenants want to take possession of the vineyard. And they think that if they kill the son of the owner of the vineyard would have been the son's inheritance, but if they kill him, that somehow the father will the vineyard to them and make it and let them inherit it, which is kind of interesting logic. And by interesting, I mean kind of dumb. You kill someone's son and now you have to give me all your stuff. Well, that's not how it works, right? There's plenty of other 501c3s, nonprofits, distant relatives, people who didn't kill your son that would be in line before you would be to inherit what belongs to the master. So their idea is just kind of silly that if we kill the son, we're going to inherit what belongs to his dad. I mean, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, does it?
Well, they're not saying, though, that they're going to inherit it. They're just saying that it's going to be theirs by reason that nobody else has been able to come and take it away from them, perhaps.
Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours.
Because we've kicked everybody else out. So unless this guy's got an army or something.
We're just going to take it.
Right.
It doesn't work that way. So already we're struck with the foolishness. The plan of the tenants is not well thought out. If you want to take the son's inheritance, you prove yourself to be a worthier son than the son, right? Because remember, back in this time, fathers wouldn't necessarily wait to die before they would give inheritance to their children. Think about the parable of the prodigal son. It's normal for heirs to receive what is their inheritance before mom and dad pass away, so that they can use what mom and dad are giving them to provide for the entire family, including mom and dad. So if you want someone to entrust their inheritance to you versus their children, you prove yourself to be more worthy, better stewards than their children, which these tenants definitely haven't done. And so it's, again, you're struck by the foolishness of these tenants. Their plan isn't going to work, right? So remember, in Luke's version, Jesus is speaking to the people here. You go back to the beginning of the parable. He began to tell the people this parable. And the people are those who are in Jerusalem for the festival. They're neither necessarily for Jesus or against him. They're just in the city. They're not the leaders that are against Jesus. Okay? So Jesus is speaking to the people, not the scribes and chief priests. They are they who heard this. And what's interesting is they object here to what Jesus is saying. What then will he do to these tenants? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Well, that makes sense. If the tenants in the vineyard are throwing your servants out and killing your kid, what are you going to do? You're going to kick them out, probably rather harshly. And the people say, not going to happen. And going, this is exactly what would happen. Why are you objecting? It'd be one thing if the group Jesus is speaking to are those who are out to get him and they know what he's talking about, and they're like, not going to happen, Jesus. You're not going to win this one. But these are the crowds he's talking to, just the people. And even they're saying, not going to happen. The question is, why are they objecting to this very reasonable response of the master to the wicked tenants? Well, if they understand what he's saying, right? And I would argue that in the Gospel of Luke, the son in the parable is Jesus. Okay. Whereas in Matthew, I'm not so sure that the son in the parable is meant to be Jesus. And this is where you get into the difference between Matthew and Luke. And again, like this is a far-fetched, but I think reasonable interpretation. Could be wrong, but I'm throwing it out there because it makes it fun. In Luke, the son in the parable is Jesus. And Jesus is saying, these tenants, and we all know who the tenants are. It's the people that are running the show in Jerusalem. They're the ones that God has left in charge of his holy city, and they've mistreated God's servants in the past, those being the prophets that were sent to them, chiefly John the Baptist. But now the Son has come, and they're going to not just mistreat the Son, they're going to kill the Son. And so different groups of people that would be represented by this crowd would object to this for different reasons. Those that came with Jesus know that Jesus would be predicting his death, and they're not about to have it. In the same way, when Jesus predicts his death to Peter, and Peter says, "No, Lord, this will never happen to you," they're having the same response. No, they're not going to throw you out of the city and kill you. And no, and then the residents of Jerusalem that are hearing this are going, wait, so if our leaders kick you out and kill you, then what you're saying is the father, the owner of the vineyard, the real king in Jerusalem, that being God the Father, is going to come and destroy the tenants and probably burn down half the city with them. No, we don't want that either. We don't want to be caught in the crossfire for God's retribution, Jesus, after they kill you. And so the different groups, the group that came with Jesus and the group that is in Jerusalem, both have a reason to object to Jesus saying, they're going to reject me and kill me, toss me out of the city. That makes sense? Possibly, maybe. One of the harder sayings, I think, in scripture, and the New Testament authors love it, has to do with the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It sounds like an easy thing to understand. People rejected Jesus, but he is the foundation of our faith, right? I mean, that's the simple interpretation. So the builders have this stone and they reject it. They don't want it. And so they do what with it? Well, keep in mind the parable. They throw it out of the city. They reject it. They throw it away. And as it lands, it now becomes the cornerstone of a new building. And the idea of everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. When it falls on anyone, it will crush him. The idea of this cornerstone is not going to go away. And so when you run up against it, you either trip over it, right? You can trip over it, right? You can fall on it. It's not going, the point is the idea of broken to pieces and falls on anyone will crush him. The point is this cornerstone is not going away, and it's going to be a thorn in the side of the people who didn't want it. And this stone that is rejected and thrown out now becomes the cornerstone of something that will be better. And we know what that is. The cornerstone the builders rejected, if you are to say that that's Jesus in his death and resurrection, he's laid the foundation for a faith that is greater than the faith of God's Old Testament people, because it is rooted in what God has already done, not just in him, in the promises of what he has yet to do. It's rooted in Christ. Okay. So far, so good. That was the easy part. Now, let's get to the fun stuff. Let's look at how Matthew tells this story, shall we? Again, Matthew, this is, Jesus is in Jerusalem. It's the same setting. He's, Here another parable, he begins. There was a master of a house who planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a wine press in it and built a tower and leased it to tenants and went into another country. When the season for fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to get his fruit. And the tenants took his servants, beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants more than the first. They did the same to them. Finally, he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and have his inheritance." And they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. When therefore the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the fruits in their seasons." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone? This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people producing its fruits. And the one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and when it falls on anyone, it will crush him." When the chief priests and Pharisees heard his parables, they perceived that he was speaking about them. And although they were seeking to arrest him, they feared the crowds because they held him to be a prophet. All right. So just some important, I think, information to understand where this is in Matthew. This comes after the parable of the two sons, which is a parable that Luke does not have. And when Jesus gives the parable of the two sons, he is speaking to the chief priests and elders of the people, not the crowds. So the audience in Matthew for Jesus' parables is different than the one in Luke. Also, this parable in Matthew comes before the parable of the wedding feast. And that the parallel passage in Luke comes while Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem in Luke chapter 14. Okay. But the main difference here is that in Luke, Jesus is speaking to the crowds. In Matthew, he is speaking to the chief priests and elders of the people. He's speaking to his enemies. Right? So let's line up these parables and see where the distinctive or unique features of each are. So here we go. We got Matthew over here, Luke over here. Yellow is when one has something that the other one doesn't have, and green is when they are saying different things, right? So in one, it's a master of a house. In Matthew, it's a master of a house. In Luke, it's just a man, right? In Luke, it specifies that he is telling the people this. In Matthew, it links to the passage before it, which then gives you the audience of the chief priests and the scribes, right? So in Matthew's gospel, the person to whom the vineyard belongs, whether he is a man or a master of the house, Matthew emphasizes the great care that this man went through to create the vineyard, whereas in Luke, that's not that important. It is for Matthew that the care and the concern of the master for his vineyard, because in Matthew, you get at the 2 chapters later, after the woe to you, scribes and Pharisees chapter, you have Jesus lamenting over Jerusalem, right? And he's going, this is God's city, and you people have ruined it. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you stone the prophets and kill those who sent you. How I would love to gather you, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wing, but you were not willing. The relationship of God to Jerusalem is very important in the Gospel of Matthew. Anyway, Luke lets us know that the man goes away for a long while. Okay. And I think that does lend a little bit of evidence to the man in the parable is God, and the son in the parable is the son. Judgment day is a long time in coming, right? When the time came in Matthew, servants are sent. In Luke, it is a servant who is sent. And in Matthew, the servants are coming to collect the fruit. In Luke, a servant is coming to get some of the fruit. Okay? So there's some differences here that give you a little bit of wiggle room in your interpretation, right? Ready to move on? All right. So the tenants took his servants, or him, beat him and sent him away empty-handed in Luke. In Matthew, they beat one, kill another, and stone another. Right? So in Matthew, the servants are given different levels of mistreatment: beat, killed, stoned. In Luke, the servant is beaten and sent away. In Matthew, he sends other servants. In Luke, another single servant is sent. In Matthew, we get more servants are sent than the first. So the master is ramping up his efforts to collect that which is his. In Matthew, there's 2 rounds of people who are sent. There are servants, and then there are more servants. In Luke, there are 3 individual servants that are sent. And they're all beaten, treated shamefully, sent out. They're not killed. In Luke, the master asks the question, what shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him. And again, I think that this inclusion of the phrase beloved son in Luke lends a little bit of evidence to Jesus is the beloved son, right? Whereas in Matthew, it's just the son. So a little bit of different language there with that. Also in Luke, perhaps they will respect my son. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. In Matthew, they're going to respect my son. And then do they? No. So the tenants, they realize we kill him, we get the inheritance. And then they do it. The same thing happens. They kill, in Luke's gospel, they kill the beloved son. And in Matthew, they kill the son whom they were to respect. Okay. In Luke, Jesus asks and answers his own question, right? When the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. In Matthew, Jesus asks the question and he gets an answer from the they. And the they in Matthew, if you are carefully reading the context, are the scribes and the chief priests. They agree with what Jesus says should happen. And the shoe drops, right? And he's saying, you are those tenants. When the people, the crowd in Luke's gospel, hear what is being said, they object to it. Surely not. But again, there's a difference here. Okay? So in Luke, Jesus is responding to crowds of people who say, this shouldn't happen. We don't want this, or this isn't going to happen. We don't want it to happen. This shouldn't happen. And he's explaining, of course it's going to happen. This is what is written. In Matthew, Jesus is doing a, haha, gotcha. You agree with me what should happen to these wicked tenants. You're the wicked tenants, right? You're the ones that have mistreated and killed the servants and the son of the master. Okay. And there's a little bit of difference there at the end. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken. And in Matthew, it's the one who falls on the stone will be broken into pieces. And if someone wants to write a 5-page type, double-spaced, 12-point font, regular margin paper as to why that's different, that's fine. I think the main difference is into whom Jesus is speaking, and the purpose of his use of the Old Testament, the cornerstone reference. In Luke, he's trying to prove to the crowds it has to happen this way. The stone needs to be rejected so that it can become the cornerstone. And in Matthew, he's doing a gotcha on the people who are out to get him. You're the ones that are doing this. So in Matthew, I would argue the chief priests and the scribes in Jerusalem have not conspired to kill Jesus yet. So they wouldn't know that he's talking about them if the son in the parable is Jesus. This is for the Gospel of Matthew, right? They haven't killed him yet. They haven't decided to kill him yet. They have killed, Jerusalem has killed the prophets in the Old Testament that were sent to her. And most recently, I made a big deal about this, they have killed the prophet John. Herod has, but the leadership in Jerusalem was complicit in his death, and that they didn't do anything to prevent it. And so I believe that in the Gospel of Matthew, the son in the parable is in reference to John the Baptist, and Jesus is coming as the owner of the vineyard. This is Jerusalem belongs to me. It's mine. You've done all these things, and I'm coming now to do what you said the owner would do. Put those wretches to a miserable death, right? Or put those wretches to a miserable death and let out the vineyard to other tenants who will give them the fruit in their seasons. And Jesus is saying, that's why I've come to Jerusalem. And that's why after this parable, a few sections later, is when the leadership decides we need to get rid of this guy because he's coming to get us. Whereas in Luke, he is explaining to the crowds, he is the son in the parable. This is why I have to die. They're going to throw me out of the city and kill me so that the stone the builders rejected becomes the chief cornerstone. This has to happen. And that's also why the crowd is saying no, because some of the crowd is the ones with him, and they don't want him to be thrown out and die. The other crowd from Jerusalem doesn't want there to be a big ruckus in Jerusalem as the master gives retribution to those who killed his son. So again, you have the two reasons for why they wouldn't want this to happen. Does that make sense? A little bit, maybe. It's far-fetched, I get it, but I also think it's reasonable. Which then, if you're going to play it out, if Matthew and Luke are allowed to have two different interpretations for the parable, right, then you can make the case that parables don't necessarily always have to only have one meaning. To the delight of postmodern people everywhere. So that's what we talked about. Cool. We got through this rather quickly.
So, can I?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's what I'm hearing you say is, for example, like if you are trying to get a message across to me and you are telling me a story because you want me to get, it's not like Jesus was recounting some actual event. He was using a story to convey a message to certain people so he could create the story in a way that the message would get across to his audience, right? Is that what I'm hearing you say? One was to the people where in Luke, looking at my Bible here, where it was more the people, and it looked like the scribes and Pharisees came up when he was talking a little bit before, but then in Matthew it was more to the scribes and Pharisees.
Mhm.
Is that
So
what
which
I'm
one was it
hearing?
really, right? I mean, that's the follow-up question is, well, which one is it really? And this is, Luke is, we have to remember that what we say is inspired, infallible, and inerrant isn't the thing that actually happened that the gospel writers are writing about, but it is the text itself. And so one of the flaws of the Jesus seminar is, and the higher critical school is, they're trying to get behind the text to figure out what really happened, right? And we don't know what happened outside of what is written.
Mhm.
All we know is that the text we have is inspired, infallible, and inerrant, and is the source and norm for Christian doctrine and practice. So for us to try to figure out what was Jesus' real intent when he gave what he actually said to whoever he was saying it to, that's, I mean, that's where you get your PhDs. That's where you get your doctorate in, New Testament studies, but it's not good exegesis. The exegesis is to look at the Gospel of Luke and say, what is being taught here based on the world and the gospel that Luke has created, based on the evidence of the text. And then you hop over to Matthew, and now you're in Matthew. And what is Matthew's purpose for putting this this parable here? Now, what's interesting is they both agree where the parable goes, but Matthew follows it up with a parable that Luke has back in chapter 14 when Jesus is on his way down. So they're free to rearrange the stories wherever they want. Now, you could also argue that, well, Jesus gave the same parable more than once. You could argue that's what he's doing here. He gave one parable to the chief priests and the scribes, and he gave a very similar sounding parable, but with a different meaning, to two crowds of people on the same day of Holy Week, both in the temple. It's possible. And then you can actually say, this is actually what happened and what Jesus actually meant by it. But all we have is the text, and we don't believe it's the story behind the text that is inspired, but it's the text itself. See, the Jesus seminar and a lot of liberal scholar criticism stuff tries to get behind the text, for you that's in front, tries to get behind the text and figure out what really happened. And this is the stuff that matters. We would say, no, it's the text that matters. The text is the inspired thing. That's why, for example, I believe it was, I should know this. I think it was Tertullian that tried to create a harmony of the Gospels for Passion Week. And some churches do this. They take all four Gospels. A Prince of Peace did this growing up. Well, you weren't growing up. I was growing up. Prince of Peace did that when we were there and I was a child. And for Holy Week, they would compile the four Gospel accounts of Holy Week and try to make one cohesive story from all four Gospels and string it together. And it ends up being a very long Good Friday service. But anyway, and people love it because you're getting, oh yeah, I remember, and it's just different chunks of the Gospels to tell a coherent story. The problem is the early church came out and told, I think, I'm not sure, I think it was Tertullian, told him that's heresy, not that's a bad idea, or I don't think so. They said it was heresy. In other words, if you do this, you will be driven away from the faith. This will drive you away from the faith, trying to put the Gospels together to make one coherent narrative that tells one story. The early church understood Matthew is Matthew, Mark is Mark, Luke is Luke, and John is John. And you don't try to combine them because that's not what's inspired. Matthew is inspired, Mark's inspired, Luke's inspired, John's inspired, as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Does that make sense?
Yes. Now the idea of like putting the Gospels, whether together, that's actual events, right? Whereas the parable has a little more leeway where you can use the story how you need to,
Mhm.
right?
Exactly. Exactly. Matthew can use it for his purposes. Luke can use it for his, because Jesus hasn't told you what it means. So you're not bound to one understanding of what the parable is outside of the text in which it's given. But also, I mean, we can make this even more fun for you. Remember when Jesus at the beginning, when he says why he speaks in parables, why is he speaking in parables?
So you'll understand.
So that the disciples will understand, but so that those who are not his disciples will be even more confused. So parables were never given as a tool to teach those who are outside of faith in Christ. Never. He speaks in parables so that they will not understand. And so I guess you could argue that, well, if he's talking to the scribes and Pharisees, they shouldn't understand what he's saying. But I would argue that you have to give a little bit of wiggle room to, yeah, and sometimes he's telling a story that they're going to understand because he wants to be able to point the finger at them and say, that's you. Right?
So it's
Just like
plausible.
Nathan and David, right? You are the man.
Mhm. So it's something plausible, but they wouldn't be able to understand the depth or be able to get into Jesus's meaning.
Generally, I mean, it really, to me, it's interesting the gospel writers include that they would tell you that the reason why Jesus speaks in parables isn't because he wants to and he's Jesus and he can teach however he wants to, and the disciples figure these parables out, but that they would go so far as to say, to include the reason, it's so that those who are not aligned with Christ will not understand what he's saying. That flies in the face of our desire to proclaim Christ in an intelligent way to people who are rejecting him. When Jesus speaks in riddles to them, we want to speak very plainly. And the reason for that is Jesus hasn't told us to speak in parables to the nations to confuse them further. He's told us to proclaim the gospel to all nations. And the example given to us by his disciples is they proclaim the gospel to people who don't know Christ, who are against Christ, in as clear a way as possible. So the idea of speaking in parables so that the world will not understand seems to be unique to Christ and not to his followers.
Of counterintuitive that he would do it that way, because the scribes and the Pharisees were the educated class, and they would have been much more familiar with different literary forms because they were literate. Whereas the fishermen and such, they wouldn't. They're much more tactile with their lives. It just gets done by your own efforts. But to use that device is an interesting twist. You would expect that they would use word games more with the educated class thing, that rather than the reverse, which I actually did.
And in a way, maybe that makes his disciples feel like, haha, Jesus is speaking to us in code that we understand, but Mr. McSmarty Pants over there doesn't get it. And it fits in well with the Lucan theme, Fred, of the low become high and the high become low. Now, who's the educated class? It's the ones who understand the parables of Jesus. Why? Because he's opened their minds to understand them, not the guy walking around, with his tweed jacket and his, walking around with his hands clasped behind his back. It is the fishermen. They're the new educated class. Cool. So that was kind of hard to understand, maybe, but to me, it was fun to see the two parallel passages because there's so much in Matthew and Luke that they don't share, and the subtle differences can, I think, inform a different interpretation of the text. Could. You don't have to. You can disagree, and Pastor Coop will be your best friend if you don't. But there is some leeway there in how Matthew and Luke present the parable. That if you choose to gloss over those differences, I think you can do that. But it's kind of fun to go, well, what if these differences are here for a reason?
Duncan,
Yeah, Mom.
Uh, I think it would be such an interesting lesson for all of us who are watching to have you and Coop together, you know, on one of these Zoom sessions discussing that, how you differ in interpreting that parable in Matthew.
It ends up with me pulling rank and him talking about how old I am.
Well, maybe it won't be as interesting as I think it would be. Okay.
No, and so the idea of in the Matthew version that the son is not the son, but the son is John the Baptist and Jesus is the master. You can't find a lot of support for that interpretation in the early church. The vast majority of the early church would agree with him that the son is the son and the father or the owner of the vineyard is the father. The problem I have is in reading commentaries, the reason they give for why to me is very lazy. When there's a son in a parable, Jesus is the son, it must be him. And God the Father, who's going to be giving fathers give inheritances to sons, and so that must be God the Father giving the inheritance to his son. And to me, that's lazy. Try to do better. And the question then remains, and this is where this is me and Coop, because we do have this discussion in the office and it's fun. RK knows sometimes we do this at staff meeting and it makes some of the other staff nervous because we kind of get into it. But I would argue that how would they know that he's speaking about them? How would the scribes and chief priests know that Jesus is speaking about him if he's the son in the parable who's already been put to death? When the leadership in Jerusalem doesn't decide to put Jesus to death until the beginning of chapter 26, after the eschatological discourse. And Coop will go, yeah, but if you flip back to chapter whatever, there are some religious elites wanting to put Jesus to death back earlier and going, yeah, and they're in Galilee. And these are the guys that are in Jerusalem. It's two different groups. And this group does not decide to kill Jesus until after he does chapter 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, boom, boom, woe to you, 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 and then teaches his disciples about the eschatological judgment, that he is the one that is going to be responsible not only for the destruction of Jerusalem, but also for the judgment at the end of the age. It's after he teaches them that, that the leadership says, you got to go, but not here. So if they haven't decided to put him to death, let alone put him to death, why would they think he's speaking to them as one who put the son to death? They haven't decided to do that yet. But if the son in the parable is and again, this is Matthew's version, not Luke's. In Matthew's version, if the son in the parable is John the Baptist, who has already been put to death and with whom Jesus is very, very, very close, and now Jesus is coming into Jerusalem, you killed John the Baptist, you put the son to death, and now the owner of the vineyard has come back and he's looking for you. Woo, you're speaking to us. Whoa. And then that also makes sense that a chapter and a half later, Jesus is talking about how he's going to destroy Jerusalem. He's laying out the case. Coop doesn't have an answer for that. That'll be our little secret. Rich.
What are you saying?
From Mark fall in with the other two?
We can do that next week. I didn't look at Mark, to be honest, this week. Because then it would have been too much different colors and that would have been even more confusing. But give me a week and we can throw Mark into the mix.
Yeah, just curious.
I would throw out there that yellow and green don't stand out very well for me. Doesn't work well for my colorblind.
Oh, yeah. Brian, I remind you of the
I could not tell the difference.
between the yellow and the green.
Yeah.
In Mark, he's speaking to the leadership. He talks, a man planted a vineyard, put a fence around it. So he's speaking to the leadership, but he goes into great detail about all that the owner of the vineyard did, which is one from Luke and one, that's Matthew. He sent a servant to the tenants. Okay, so that's Luke. See where this is going? So a servant is Luke, and they beat him and sent him away. That's Luke. Another servant, that's Luke. Struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. That's another. And then the third servant, he sends a third servant. So that's Luke, 3 different servants, not groups of servants. That's Matthew. The third servant they kill. And then it says, and so with many others, some they beat and some they killed. So it's this stream of individual servants, one after another, after another, after another, which begs the question. So you're like the 10th servant in line, right? Go ask for fruit.
No, don't go. Don't go.
Exactly. And now you're getting into the head of how Mark views the role of the Old Testament prophets. It's your turn to go. I know they're gonna knock you on the head. They might kill you. You need to go and try to collect and try to collect and try to collect. He had still one other, a beloved son. So beloved son is Luke. Finally, he sent him to them saying, they will respect my son. That's Matthew. See, but those tenants said to one another, this is the heir, come let us kill him, the inheritance will be ours. That's both of them. They took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give their vineyard to others. So he asks and answers his own question. That is Luke. Have you not read the stone, cornerstone? So he has the Lucan answer of, he asks and answers his own question, but the crowd doesn't cry out, no, 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 because he's not speaking to the crowd. He's speaking to the leadership, which explains why in verse 12, they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, for they perceived that he had told a parable against them. So they left him and went away. So Mark, you have mixing of both. Elements of both. So then you can get into your Jesus seminar stuff on, was Mark written first and Matthew and Luke maybe borrowed from him? Or was Mark written last and tries to harmonize Matthew and Luke? And the answer is good luck trying to figure that out.
Okay.
Because what's inspired, infallible, and inerrant is the text. Yes, Mom.
Does the John have any parables in it? He doesn't do parables, right?
John doesn't do parables at all.
Good.
Yeah. And you'll have to ask him why, or why not.
Mhm. I'm glad.
Cool. All right. So next week, if you want, we can start. We haven't looked at any of the parables in Mark. Maybe we should move over to that and begin to look at how Mark uses parables and the parables he has and all that. So, and I apologize. I need to apologize, Adam, not because you can't tell the difference between green and yellow, although we'll try to do better next time. It's that I was using Packer colors when my wife's a Vikings fan and I didn't even notice. So Paul, whatever kind of voodoo magic hex you've put on me, finally figured it out. So. Cool. All right. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining. I'm going to hit the stop recording here.